it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen.
Okay, my dear friends, here's a little bit of a teaser to get you into the mood for tonight's story. For 15 years, Ranger Jane Blackwood has learned to respect every danger Mount Rainier can throw at her. Avalanches, crevasses, brutal storms, and the unforgiving cold. But when experienced climbers vanish near Camp Sherman and report surface of strange vibrations beneath the glacier, Jane discovers something buried deep inside the mountain that was never supposed to be found. I'm a park ranger, and 3 climbers found something in Mount Rainier that still haunts me to this day, by Lorenzo von Matterhorn. Prologue. Mount Rainier dominated the September sky. Its glaciers caught the first light of morning and threw it back in hard, blinding flashes, forcing Jane Asher to stop and stare. She'd watched sunrises in national parks for 15 years. She'd seen mountains turn gold, red, and black before the day had even properly begun. And this was different. The mountain was singing, not literally. Jane wasn't crazy. She knew the difference between a strange sound and a hallucination. But for the past week, reports had been piling up. Hikers had heard what they described as music somewhere around the Emmons Glacier. Climbers had turned back from the summit attempts after hearing deep, unnatural sounds coming from beneath the ice. Now 3 experienced climbers had disappeared near Camp Sherman. The last radio transmission had been bad enough to keep Jane awake. Something's moving inside the glacier. Something very big. Part 1. Jane stood inside the Paradise Visitor Center, staring down at topographical maps spread across the briefing table. At 38, she'd spent enough years on Mount Rainier to understand that the mountain had its own language. Avalanches could explode down a slope with the force of artillery. Ice could crack and groan like some enormous animal waking underground. High winds could whistle through cracks and produce sounds that seemed almost human. Rainier had plenty of ways to scare people. It had even more ways to kill them. But 15 years on the mountain had taught Jane something else. There was a difference between dangerous natural phenomena and something that simply didn't belong. "Hey, you buying any of this?" Jermaine Defoe asked. Jermaine was the newest ranger at Mount Rainier. 26 years old, fresh out of training and built like a linebacker. He had the size and strength to make most people think twice, but his manner was gentle. He'd chosen conservation over confrontation, and so far the mountain hadn't managed to beat that softness out of him. His skin was already starting to show the wear that came with working at high altitude, but there was still something unmistakably young in his eyes. Jane recognized it immediately. Rookie confidence. She'd had it once. "I've learned not to dismiss anything on this mountain," Jane said. She dragged one finger across the map, following the climber's likely route toward the upper slopes. Rainier has more ways to kill you than almost any other peak in the lower 48. If experienced climbers tell us something's wrong, we listen. The door opened behind them. Chief Ranger Shane Coates walked into the briefing room. His face was hard and weather-beaten, carved by 3 decades of cold, altitude, exhaustion, and bad decisions made by other people. At 62, Coates looked like the mountain had built him itself. He'd spent 30 years at Mount Rainier. He'd seen almost everything the place could throw at a human being. He'd also watched 7 rangers die under his command or within his jurisdiction over the years. "Search and rescue is mobilizing," Coates said. There was no wasted movement in his voice. "Jane, you're leading the team. Defoe comes with you. And take 2 more." Jane looked up. Dr. Volkov from the University of Washington's already at Camp Muir with her research team. Apparently, she's been picking up unusual seismic activity all week. Seismic? Jane's head came up sharply. Nobody had mentioned volcanic activity. "Not volcanic," Coates said. "Well, that's what's strange." He stepped toward the table then. The tremors are too regular, too consistent." Jane stared at him. How regular? Volkov says they're rhythmic, almost mechanical. Well, the room itself seemed to get colder then. She thinks something's moving inside the mountain, Coates continued. Something following patterns that don't match any natural phenomenon she's familiar with. Jane said nothing at this, although a chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the September air outside. She'd felt those vibrations herself. During her last patrol, she'd noticed a faint pulsing beneath her boots. It had been so subtle she'd almost ignored it. Low vibration running through the rock and ice, disappearing before she could identify it. Every 12 minutes, exactly. At the time, she'd blamed distant avalanches, but now she wasn't so sure. Oh, if Volkov is worried, Jane said, when do we leave? 1 hour, Coates replied. Germain was already mentally running through the equipment they'd need. Yeah, 1 hour, he repeated. And then Coates looked directly at Jane. We're using emergency protocols. Something about this doesn't feel right. I've been on the mountain way longer than anyone here, and I've never felt it behave like this. Jane gave him a slow nod. She didn't need convincing. Her mind was already moving through the checklist. Ropes, ice axes, medical gear, avalanche beacons, emergency radios, extra batteries, climbing harnesses. Everything they might need if the mountain decided to turn hostile. Oh, and her service weapon. She'd carried it for 15 years and had fired it only once, to put down a rabid coyote. She had a feeling that record might not survive the day, though. Outside, Jane and Germain loaded the rescue vehicles. The morning air around Paradise was sharp and clean, but something was missing. Jane noticed it almost immediately. Silence, now, not the normal silence of the mountain, no, something deeper. The usual birds were gone. Ravens normally crowded the parking areas, hopping around tourists and waiting for someone to drop food. But this morning there wasn't a single one. Jane looked toward the rocks near the visitor center. Nothing. Even the marmots had disappeared. Now that bothered her more than the missing birds. Animals knew when something was wrong long before people did. Jane stared up toward the enormous white mass of Mount Rainier. The summit disappeared into the morning light. Somewhere beneath the ice, something was moving. She watched the empty slopes for several seconds. Nature knows something we don't, she muttered. The climb to Camp Muir took them higher fast, winding through steep mountain roads as the landscape dropped way beneath them. At just over 10,000 feet, Camp Muir was the main staging point for climbers attempting the summit of Mount Rainier. The higher they went, the worse the radio traffic became. Jane's radio kept spitting out updates from other teams scattered across the mountain. 2 more groups had reported strange activity. One team claimed they'd seen lights moving beneath the ice near Disappointment Cleaver. Another said they could feel vibrations traveling through their ice axes, steady pulses that reminded them of Morse code. Nobody had an explanation. Dr. Nina Volkov was waiting for them when they reached Camp Muir. Normally, Volkov was controlled and clinical. 15-plus years of studying Rainier's geology had given her a reputation for being almost impossible to rattle. Well, Jane had never seen her like this. The Russian-born scientist looked genuinely shaken. Jane, you need to see this. There was no greeting, no small talk. Volkov turned and led them straight into her research station. Inside, banks of monitoring equipment covered the walls. Screens flashed with graphs, waveforms, seismic readings, and streams of data that meant almost nothing to Jane. Volkov looked like she'd discovered a bomb ticking beneath the floor. Look at these patterns. She pointed toward one of the displays. Every 12 minutes and 37 seconds. Exactly. Not 12 minutes and 36 seconds, not 38. No, 12 minutes and 37. Jane stared at the screen. Look, precision is impossible for any natural phenomenon. Could it be man-made? Germain asked. Mining equipment. Somebody prospecting illegally. Volkov shook her head. Not possible. She moved to another monitor. Look at the energy involved. To produce these signatures, you'd need industrial-scale equipment. Something massive. You couldn't hide that on Mount Rainier. She paused then. Oh, and then there's the depth. Jane frowned. The signals are coming from inside the glacier. How deep? At least 200 feet. Jane studied the readings again then. A bad feeling was settling into her stomach. The missing climbers were heading toward Camp Sherman, she said. Volkov nodded. That's directly above the strongest signals. Jane looked at her. So, they were walking straight toward it. Yes. Volkov suddenly grabbed Jane's arm and pulled her away from the others. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. My instruments picked up something else. What? Radio frequencies. Jane waited for her to continue. We, can't identify them. Military? No. Emergency? No. Volkov shook her head. They aren't human communication bands. They started 3 days ago. That's when the vibrations began. Jane could feel the cold move through her. You're saying something's broadcasting from inside the glacier. I'm saying something is active down there. Volkov's eyes remained fixed on hers. And we have no idea what it is. Oh, that was enough. Jane made the call. Germain, get Torres and Nakamura from search and rescue. We're going to Camp Sherman. Germain looked toward the windows. The weather was deteriorating by the minute. Dark clouds were gathering under Rainier's summit, swallowing the upper mountain. Why in this weather? Full glacier gear. He hesitated, though. The storm's moving in. Exactly why we move now. Jane checked her watch. Those climbers have been missing for 18 hours. Nobody said anything at this. Look, if they're hurt, she let the sentence die. There was no need to finish it. 18 hours at altitude was dangerous under the best conditions. With a storm bearing down on Mount Rainier, the odds became brutal. The 4-person team left Camp Muir at 1 in the afternoon. Jane took the lead. Germain followed close behind. Mike Torres came third, a scarred, grizzled search and rescue veteran who'd spent enough years in the mountains to know exactly how quickly a routine rescue could turn into a body recovery. Amy Nakamura brought up the rear. She was a paramedic who'd spent years working in urban emergency services before transferring to mountain rescue 5 years earlier. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. They followed the standard route toward Disappointment Cleaver, climbing steadily through the glacier terrain. Then the mountain changed. Jane noticed it first beneath her boots. The ice felt strange, not soft, but not unstable, just not right. The solid blue glacier ice she knew had a different texture, a different resistance. This felt as though there was something underneath it, something warm. Jane stopped and pressed her boot down. A faint vibration answered. The ice seemed to pulse. Now that should have been impossible. At this altitude, temperatures had remained below freezing for long stretches. There was no reason for the glacier to feel warm beneath her crampons. They kept climbing, though. And at 12,000 feet, Germain suddenly stopped. Jane! She turned. Look at your ice axe. Jane looked down. The metal head was vibrating, not violently, but steadily enough that she could feel the humming through her gloves and into her fingers. She stared at it, and then frost began spreading across the metal. At first she thought it was ordinary condensation freezing. Then she saw the pattern. The frost wasn't forming randomly. It was arranging itself into precise geometric shapes, perfect hexagons. Repeating again and again across the surface, connected in intricate patterns that looked disturbingly similar to miniature circuit boards. "Ew, what the hell?" Torres muttered. He lifted his own ice axe. The same thing was happening. Then Nakamura checked her climbing hardware. The pattern was spreading across everyone's metal equipment. Nobody spoke at first, and for several seconds the only sound was the wind. Then they heard something, except Jane wasn't sure they'd actually heard it. It wasn't coming through the air. It seemed to be inside her head. A low vibrating hum roared through her skull. The glacier was making the sound, and it wasn't music, it wasn't speech, but it had rhythm, structure, and intent. Something in Jane's oldest instincts recognized that immediately. This wasn't an avalanche, it wasn't shifting ice. It was something strange, a geological phenomenon. Something was there, and it was something intelligent. Something that had been moving beneath them while they climbed higher and higher toward it. Every primitive warning system in Jane's brain was screaming at her to turn around. We keep moving," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "The climbers." And a sound like thunder tore across the glacier. Jane barely had time to react. 50 feet ahead of them, the ice split open. Everyone froze. A crevasse would have been threatening enough, but this wasn't a crevasse. The opening was perfectly rectangular. Its edges were unnaturally straight, smooth as polished glass, as if something had cut through hundreds of feet of ancient glacier with a machine. Light spilled from the darkness below. Jane expected the familiar blue-white glow of sunlight filtered through thick ice. It wasn't blue. It was green, a deep sickly green that seemed almost organic. And the humming stopped. For one terrible second, the mountain was completely silent. And then something spoke from inside the opening. It wasn't English, it wasn't any language Jane had ever heard. Yet somehow, impossibly, she understood exactly what it meant. "Finally." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Someone can hear me." Jermaine seized Jane by the arm. "Hey, we need to go, now." Jane was already moving. She couldn't explain why. Every instinct she'd developed during 15 years as a Mount Rainier ranger was screaming at her to retreat, get distance, call for backup, follow procedure. Don't approach an unknown threat inside a glacier. But something deeper than mere training was pulling her forward. Something ancient and something buried beneath reason. Part 2. "Jane!" Jermaine's shout sounded far away, muffled by the strange pressure filling the air around them. She reached the edge of the opening, and then she looked down. What she saw below destroyed every comfortable assumption she'd ever made about the world, about reality, about humanity's place in it. 30 feet below her, the 3 missing climbers were floating in midair. They were surrounded by the unnatural green light. They were alive. Jane could see their chests rising and falling. But they weren't alone. Something occupied the space around them. Jane tried to focus on it, but her eyes couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. It was as if the thing existed in more dimensions than the human brain had evolved to perceive. Every time she thought she found its shape, the shape changed. Her mind desperately searched for something familiar. Machine, organism, structure. None of those words fit, but all of them did. The thing appeared to be made from the glacier itself. Ice twisted into geometric forms that shouldn't have been possible. Surfaces folded into angles her eyes couldn't properly follow. Places that looked solid suddenly opened into impossible depths. Jane could see crystalline corridors extending far beyond the physical boundaries of the ice. There was no way they could exist inside Mount Rainier. No way. Yet there they were. "Do not fear," the voice returned. It didn't enter through Jane's ears. It appeared directly inside her mind. "I mean you no harm." There was something strangely calm about this. "I've waited a very long time for minds capable of making contact." Jane swallowed hard, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she forced the words out. "What are you?" The answer came immediately. "I am what your species would call a refugee." The ice around the entity shifted. "My vessel crashed here 11,000 of your years ago, during the period you call the Younger Dryas." Jane stared down into the impossible depths. "I've remained dormant since then, healing, waiting." From behind her, footsteps crunched. Jermaine had reached her. Torres and Nakamura were right behind him. All four stood frozen at the edge of the opening. 30 feet below, the missing climbers remained suspended in the green glow. Jane could finally identify them. The Henderson expedition. Well, their faces were calm, almost peaceful. Nakamura stared down at them. "Are they... They are unharmed," the entity replied. It hadn't needed her to finish the question. Jane realized it could hear all of them. "I needed to understand your biology, your neural patterns." The three climbers had volunteered their consciousness for communication, apparently. "What, they volunteered?" Torres's hand moved instinctively toward his rescue equipment, and his voice hardened. "What, you mean you took them?" "I requested their participation. They agreed." The entity's voice remained calm throughout. "Your species has changed remarkably since my arrival. When I crashed here, your ancestors had barely developed language. Now you possess advanced technology, complex civilizations, and even primitive spaceflight. You are almost ready." Jane felt a knot tighten in her stomach at that. Ready? Ready for what? She wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The entity changed shape then. The ice around it rearranged itself, forming patterns that somehow carried emotion. Jane couldn't explain how, but she knew what they meant. Loneliness, hope, desperation, and something that felt like unbearable patience. "I am ready to no longer be alone. Your planet is one of millions that contain life, yet you believe yourselves unique. And that belief has isolated you, and isolation has slowed your development as a species. Now, I arrived here by accident. Perhaps that accident was not meaningless. Perhaps I was meant to become a bridge between what you are and what you could become." Jermaine stepped closer now. His scientific training was beginning to overpower his fear. "Wait, you're saying you're extraterrestrial?" The entity's form shifted again. "I am from elsewhere, yes, an explorer as you might describe yourselves. My people travel through the universe. We map worlds, we catalog life. We establish connections between conscious species." The voice seemed to grow quieter then. "But my vessel was damaged while passing through your system's asteroid belt. I barely survived the crash. The ice preserved me. It kept me alive long enough to heal. But I remained trapped, unable to communicate, unable to leave. I waited until your technology had advanced enough to detect my presence." Jane's radio suddenly exploded with static at that, and everyone jumped. Then a voice broke through. "Jane, what's your status?" It was Coates. His voice was distorted by interference, but there was an urgency underneath it. Volkov's instruments just went completely insane. She's detecting energy signatures that shouldn't exist. Jane stared into the green-lit depths. She had no idea what she was supposed to say to explain this. She'd keep the radio. Chief, we've located the climbers. Static hissed around her words. They're alive, but we've got a situation up here. The entity suddenly changed again. Its presence intensified. The air seemed to tighten. The green light beneath them brightened. Then the voice entered Jane's mind again. Others are coming. Jane looked toward Germaine. What others? Military. This answer was immediate. They've been monitoring my awakening for weeks now. Jane's stomach dropped when she heard this. Wait, they know you're here? I have been watching. The entity's voice carried something Jane hadn't heard before. Fear. They will not seek understanding. They will seek control. Well, as if the mountain itself had been waiting for the cue, Jane heard the unmistakable thump of helicopter rotors. But these weren't Park Service rescue choppers. No, the sound was deeper and heavier. Military. Black Hawks, no doubt. Jane looked toward the northern sky. 3 helicopters were coming in fast and low, cutting across the slopes of Mount Rainier. Their rotors hammered the thin mountain air as they closed on the team. Torres stared upward. How the hell do you know about our military? The entity answered without hesitation. I've been listening to your communications for decades. Jane felt a chill once more. Radio transmissions, satellites, internet data, your digital networks. The voice seemed almost detached. I learned your languages, your cultures, your history, your fears. A pause then. I learned what your governments do to things they cannot understand. The first Black Hawk was directly overhead now, and its side door opened. Rappel lines dropped toward the glacier. Figures in white Arctic combat gear began sliding down toward them, one after another, boots striking the ice. Jane watched them descend. There were too many, and they were armed. Please. The entity's voice had changed now, and for the first time Jane heard genuine fear. Not anger, not aggression, fear. I've been patient for thousands of your years. I mean you no harm. The green light beneath the glacier flickered. But if they attack me, I will defend myself. The mountain gave a deep, distant groan. And your mountain will suffer. Jane's mind raced. Every piece of training she'd ever received over the 15 years of her career told her the same thing. Step back. Let the authorities take control. Don't interfere with federal operations. But Jane looked down at the impossible being beneath the glacier, and she could feel what it was feeling. Loneliness, hope, and fear. It had survived 11,000 years beneath Mount Rainier without attacking anyone. Now armed soldiers had arrived with orders to capture it. If this turned into a firefight, there was a good chance nobody walked away. Germaine, Torres, Nakamura. Jane's voice was firm. Form a perimeter. Torres stared at her. Jane, those are federal soldiers. This is still a rescue operation under Park Service jurisdiction. Those men aren't going to care about jurisdiction. Jane turned toward him then. They'll have to hear it from me. She looked down into the opening. The entity was watching. Can you release the climbers? The green glow pulsed. Show them we're not your enemy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light intensified. The 3 climbers began rising, slowly and silently. They floated upward through the rectangular opening until they cleared the edge of the glacier. All 3 suddenly gasped. They collapsed onto the ice as though waking from the deepest sleep imaginable. Nakamura was on them instantly. Easy. Stay still. She checked their pupils, their breathing, their pulse, and responsiveness. They're alive, she called. Jane barely had time to react before the first soldier had reached the glacier. His rifle was raised, not directly aimed at anyone, and yet, well, he stopped several yards away. "Ma'am." The voice was controlled and professional. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, United States Air Force Space Command." His tactical goggles hid his eyes. "This area is now under military jurisdiction. You and your personnel are ordered to evacuate immediately." But Jane didn't move. Under what authority? Harrison's posture hardened at this. "This is a national security operation." This is a national park rescue operation," Jane shot back. "We have 3 civilians who need medical attention." Well, Harrison's voice became colder. "We've detected an anomalous entity beneath this glacier with unknown capabilities and potentially hostile intent." "Potentially," Jane said, but Harrison didn't respond. "Stand aside, Ranger." "Hey, it's not hostile." Well, the voice came from Jermaine. He stepped forward before Jane could stop him. "It's just a stranded traveler." Harrison turned toward him. Well, Jermaine continued. "It's been here for thousands of years without hurting anyone." By now, more soldiers had reached the glacier, 12 in total. They spread out with practiced precision, weapons ready, forming a tactical ring around the opening. Harrison touched his radio. "Asset confirmed." A pause. "Preparing containment protocol." Jane's stomach tightened. Then the glacier moved. The ice beneath their feet shuddered. Everyone froze. It wasn't an earthquake. Jane knew what an earthquake felt like. This was different. This was deliberate. Cracks began spreading from the rectangular opening. They didn't fracture randomly. They formed spirals, perfect, precise spirals radiating outward across the glacier. Then the temperature dropped. 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Jane's breath turned white. "You're making a mistake," she told Harrison, but he didn't look at her. "He's trying to communicate." "My orders are clear." "It's not attacking." Harrison finally turned toward her. "Stand down." Then he raised one hand toward his soldiers. "Right, deploy the containment field." The military team moved. They began unloading equipment Jane had never seen before. Well, some of it looked familiar. Power systems, emitters, reinforced cases. But other components were completely alien to her. It looked like military technology pushed years beyond anything the public was supposed to know about. The soldiers positioned themselves and the devices around the opening, and they activated them. The effect was immediate. The air seemed to thicken. Jane felt pressure pushing against her chest, and her ears popped. The hairs on her arms stood upright. The entity's voice suddenly broke through her mind. Its calm tone was gone. "They seek to imprison me." And the voice distorted, almost cracking under the strain. "I've already spent millennia imprisoned in ice. I will not accept another cage." Well, the glacier responded, and ice erupted from the ground. There was no explosion, though, no wild destruction. No, the movement was precise and controlled. Walls of blue ice surged upward around the soldiers, cutting them off from one another. One wall, then another, and within seconds every soldier was trapped inside an individual chamber of crystal-clear ice. They were unharmed, but completely immobilized. Their weapons were trapped with them. Harrison was the only soldier left outside. He raised his rifle toward the opening. Jane moved before she even realized what she was doing. She stepped directly between Harrison and the entity. "Stand down." Harrison's weapon remained raised, though. "Stand aside, Ranger." But Jane didn't move. "That's an order." She looked him directly in the face. "I don't take orders from you." Behind her, the green light pulsed beneath the glacier. Jane's voice hardened. and you're about to start an interspecies incident because you're scared of something you don't understand. Part 3. Behind Jane, she could feel the entity growing stronger. The 3 rescued climbers were sitting upright now, dazed but conscious. One of them, Dr. Marcus Henderson, a theoretical physicist whose name Jane suddenly remembered, stared toward the glacier with open disbelief. "You have no idea what this means." His voice carried something close to wonder. What it showed us, the universe, the connections between living things. He looked toward the soldiers trapped inside their ice barriers. There are thousands of species out there, maybe millions. They're waiting for us to become advanced enough to join them. His expression hardened then. "Do you want to put the messenger in a cage?" Harrison's finger tightened around the trigger. "I have my orders." The glacier beneath him suddenly disappeared. Not cracked, not shattered, it liquefied. 1 second Harrison was standing on solid ice, the next he dropped through it up to his chest. Before he could react, the glacier hardened again. Ice locked around his body, trapping him in place. He was still breathing, still conscious, completely unharmed. "Enough," the entity spoke, and this time nobody had to hear it telepathically. The voice rolled across the glacier and echoed off Mount Rainier's frozen slopes. It sounded like wind moving through crystal, beautiful, unnatural, and completely unlike any human voice. "I will not be your prisoner." The ice beneath them vibrated then. "But neither will I be your enemy." Then the rectangular opening began to change, and the glacier moved like liquid. Walls of ice folded inward and flowed around themselves, reshaping with impossible precision. Everybody watched in silence. Then something began rising from below. People gasped. It looked like a spacecraft. But even that description was wrong. More like the idea of a spacecraft made physical. The entire thing appeared to have been formed from the glacier itself, yet its surfaces were impossibly smooth. Its curves seemed to bend the light around them. Looking directly at it made Jane's eyes struggle to focus, as though the vessel occupied more space than it physically appeared to. Parts of its surface seemed deeper than the surrounding ice. Impossible depths, impossible geometry. Propulsion systems were embedded within the structure, operating according to principles human science hadn't even discovered. "My vessel has recovered enough for limited function," the entity said. "I will leave." Jane felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. "You are clearly not ready for contact." The ship continued to rise. "But I will leave you with this." One of the climbers suddenly gasped. Jane turned. Dr. Sarah Chen, the xenobiologist from Henderson's expedition, had gone rigid. Her eyes rolled backward and they snapped open. They were glowing. The same unnatural green light that had filled the glacier burned behind her pupils. "Sarah?" Henderson moved toward her. Sarah spoke, but something about her voice was clearly wrong. It was hers and, it wasn't. "I volunteer." Everyone went silent. "I will be the bridge." Her expression remained calm. Part human, part other. She looked toward the strange vessel then. "I'll prepare your species for what comes next." "Sarah, no!" Henderson reached for her, but she stepped away. The movement was smooth, so very smooth. There was something subtly wrong with the way she moved now, something that made Jane's skin crawl. "It's okay, Marcus." Sarah smiled faintly at this. "I've seen what's out there." Her glowing eyes settled on the sky above Mount Rainier. "There's more than you could ever imagine. Civilizations that make ours look primitive. Art and science beyond anything we've developed." She then looked around at the others. "And they're waiting for us." Well, Henderson shook his head. "Sarah, we have to evolve." Her voice was calm but absolute, not just technologically. She touched her chest. Consciously. She looked toward the entity. Someone has to help guide that process. Jane watched on in stunned silence. Sarah was changing, not dramatically, not enough that someone unfamiliar with her would immediately notice. But the woman standing in front of them wasn't quite the same person who had come down from the glacier. Her skin now carried a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Her eyes seemed deeper than before, as though the light inside them extended far beyond the physical eye. Well, she was still human, but something else had been added. "This is my gift," the entity said. "A bridge." The vessel hummed above them. "She will live among you. She will teach. She will prepare you." A pause. "In 50 of your years, others will come." The entity's voice carried across the frozen slopes. "Officially and openly." The ship began to rise then. "Be ready." The vessel lifted away from the glacier without producing a sound. No roar of engines, no blast of exhaust. It simply rose. Gravity seemed to have forgotten it existed. The trapped soldiers were released as the ice around them melted away. They collapsed onto the glacier, stunned and shaken but alive. Harrison finally tore himself free. He immediately reached for his weapon, but there was nothing left to shoot. The ice vessel was already climbing toward the clouds, passed through the cloud layer above Mount Rainier and disappeared into the sky. And then, well, everything went to hell. Within minutes, military helicopters were swarming over the mountain. Government vehicles arrived. Men and women in hazmat suits moved against the glacier. Communications equipment appeared, and temporary barriers went up. The entire area was being transformed into something that looked less like a rescue site and more like a military occupation. Jane barely had time to understand what was happening before she and the others were separated. Germain went onto one helicopter, Torres onto another. Nakamura was taken somewhere else, and Jane was loaded into a fourth aircraft. As the helicopter lifted away from the glacier, she looked through the window. Teams were already sealing off the area. Heavy equipment was being brought in. Structures were going up around the opening. Looked like they intended to stay, not for days and not for weeks, possibly forever. Jane wasn't taken back to the ranger station, though. She was flown straight to Joint Base Lewis McCord. From there, she was led into a sterile interrogation room and placed in front of a panel of officials whose names and agencies meant nothing to her. For 12 hours, they questioned her. Every detail, every word, every sound, every movement the entity had made. They wanted to know what Jane had seen, what she'd heard, what she'd felt. They asked the same questions repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies. But there was one subject they kept returning to. Dr. Sarah Chan. During the confusion surrounding the military response, Sarah had disappeared. Well, the officials wanted to know exactly where she'd gone. She just vanished. Jane repeated these words for what must have been the 5th time. 1 second she was standing there. Changed, yes, but still Sarah. And then she was gone. The lead interrogator sat across from her, perfectly still. The woman had only introduced herself as Director Madison. Well, she leaned forward. "Ranger Asher, you need to understand the seriousness of what happened. An extraterrestrial intelligence may have compromised a human citizen. This is a national security matter of the highest level." "Compromised?" Jane gave a bitter laugh. "That's what you're calling it?" Madison's expression did not change. "She saved those climbers. She could have killed every one of us down there. Instead, she tried to communicate. Look, it offered knowledge, yeah? It tried to make contact." Jane then leaned forward.
What did we do? She shook her head. Yeah, we pointed guns at it. We brought in containment equipment. We treated it like a hostile weapon. Still, Madison didn't blink. That entity arrived on Earth without authorization, concealed itself for thousands of years, and has now altered a human being without our permission. It crashed here by accident. Jane's voice sharpened even more. It didn't invade us, it just survived. That is your interpretation. It waited for us to become capable of understanding it. Jane was staring across the table now, and Sarah volunteered. I heard her say it. Madison's expression remained cold, though. What you heard was potentially an alien intelligence speaking through a compromised human subject. She was conscious. You cannot prove that. Neither can you prove she wasn't. Madison folded her hands. We have no way of knowing whether Dr. Chen's consent was genuine or whether she was coerced. Questioning continued. For 3 days of fluorescent lights, cold rooms, the same questions asked in different ways. Well, they wanted to know every detail of what had happened on Mount Rainier. Every word the entity had spoken, every movement, every sensation, every detail Jane could remember about Sarah Chen. Eventually, they brought her documents. Non-disclosure agreements, legal threats, orders dressed up as paperwork. Well, the terms were brutally simple. Never speak about what happened on the mountain, not to friends, not to family, not to journalists, not to anyone. Violation could mean life imprisonment. Jane signed. She didn't have much choice. While she signed each document, she memorized everything she could. Names, dates, questions, answers, details. She'd find a way to preserve the truth somehow, even if it took years. When they finally released her, Jermaine was waiting outside the base. Jane stopped beside him. They let you go too? Jermaine nodded. The optimism that had once been so obvious in him was now gone, though. Yeah, they made it pretty clear that my career depends on keeping my mouth shut. He glanced back toward the base. Oh, my freedom, too. He hesitated. And, possibly my life. Torres and Nakamura had received the same treatment. The four of them drove back toward Mount Rainier in silence. Nobody knew what to say. The mountain looked the same from the road, but it wasn't the same anymore. The entire northern face had been closed to the public. The official explanation was unstable ice conditions, but Jane knew better. Military vehicles were everywhere, many disguised beneath the cover of scientific research operations. The federal presence around the park was impossible to miss if you knew what you were looking for. Chief Coates met Jane and Jermaine at the ranger station. His face was grim. Well, they've taken over the Emmons Glacier sector. Jane looked at him. How much? We're not allowed within 5 miles. 5 miles? Coates nodded. Well, they call it, temporary. He glanced toward the windows. They're putting up permanent structures. Jane's stomach tightened. What about Dr. Volkov? Transferred. Where? Coates lowered his voice now. Apparently she received an offer from a university in Russia that she couldn't refuse. Jane stared at him. Wait, and her research? All her equipment and data were confiscated. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Coates looked directly at Jane. What really happened up there, Jane? Jane wanted to tell him. God, she wanted to tell him everything. But she'd spent 3 days being reminded that walls had ears. The ranger station was probably wired by now. She kept her expression neutral and said, We found the climbers. Coates waited. There was an unusual ice formation. Another pause. And the military took over from there. Coates looked at her. He knew, not everything, but enough to understand that Jane was deliberately leaving things out. And so he didn't push. "Well," he said quietly, "I'm glad you're both back." And then he stood. "Hey, take a week off, paid leave." Jane frowned at this. "That's an order from above." That night, Jane sat alone in her cabin near Mount Rainier. Outside, the mountain dominated the darkness. She stared toward the northern face. There were lights up there, not climbers, not rescue crews. Steady lights, industrial lights. The unmistakable glow of a military installation buried high in the wilderness. They were searching for something, Jane knew it. Maybe traces of the entity, maybe technology. But deep down she suspected they were looking for someone else. Sarah Chen. Part 4. A knock at the door broke the silence. Jane reached for the handle, and when she opened it, Marcus Henderson stood outside. The theoretical physicist from the rescued expedition looked exhausted. Well, not tired, haunted. "Dr. Henderson? Can I come in?" Jane stepped aside. As he entered, she noticed a vehicle parked farther down the road. Too far away to be casual. Federal agents, no doubt, still watching. Jane closed the door. Henderson lowered himself into a chair. "I need to, talk to someone who was there." He looked at her. "Someone who understands what happened." Jane poured him some coffee. He wrapped both his hands around the cup. "They questioned me for days." "About what?" "Everything." His eyes remained fixed on the coffee. "What the entity showed me. What I saw while I was connected to it. What I learned." Jane was sitting opposite him. "What did it show you?" Henderson didn't answer immediately. For a long time, he just stared into the cup. "Everything." He finally looked up. "Well, as much as my human brain could handle." His voice was quiet. "Galactic civilizations, entire societies spread across worlds. Technology that makes everything we've built look primitive." Jane listened. "Faster than light travel," Henderson continued. "But not the way we've imagined it. They use consciousness itself as part of the medium." He just shook his head. "There are forms of art that exist in dimensions we can't even perceive." "And Earth?" Jane asked. Henderson's expression changed at this. "Earth is, protected." "Protected?" "Think of it like a nature preserve." Jane stared at him. "We're in a preserve?" "Something like that." He leaned back then. "Developing species are monitored. They aren't contacted until they reach certain milestones." Jane looked toward the window. Mount Rainier was invisible in the darkness, but she could feel its presence. "And the entity?" "Oh, an accident." Henderson swallowed. "Its crash violated the rules." Then he rubbed his eyes. "And that's why it stayed hidden for so long. Try not to interfere with our development." Jane said nothing at this. "But look at us," Henderson continued. "Our weapons, our wars, the way we keep destroying the planet we depend on." And then his voice hardened. "Look, we're approaching a point where they may have to take action, make a decision." "About us?" Henderson nodded. "They'll have to decide whether humanity is worth saving." He now looked directly at Jane. "Or whether we're too dangerous to be allowed to spread beyond Earth." Jane felt a cold shiver run down her spine at this. "Dr. Chen?" Henderson looked toward the dark window. Sarah understood all of this more clearly than any of us. He spoke slowly now, choosing his words carefully. She realized humanity needs guides, teachers, someone who can prepare us for what's coming. Jane still said nothing. She volunteered because she saw what happens if we remain alone. She wasn't controlled, she wasn't forced. Henderson shook his head, though. Yeah, she chose it because she understood the alternative. Now he looked directly at Jane. Humanity standing alone, completely unprepared when the protection around Earth finally ends. Jane's stomach tightened. Do you know where she is? Henderson shook his head. No. And he hesitated. But I do know she's alive. Changed? Yeah. He gave a faint smile. Changed, but still Sarah. He looked down at his hands. You know, sometimes I dream about her. In those dreams, she's teaching people, showing them fragments of what I saw, giving them just enough to understand what's waiting for us. He looked then toward the mountain, preparing us. Over the following weeks, Jane tried to force herself back into normal life, but it didn't work. She returned to her duties as a Mount Rainier ranger, checked routes, dealt with hikers, inspected equipment, and responded to the usual problems. But nothing felt normal anymore. Every unusual ice formation caught her attention. Every strange sound from the mountain made her stop and listen. A groan beneath the glacier, a vibration under her boots, a light where no light should have been. She noticed all of it. And Jermaine, well, he was the same. Whatever innocence he'd had before the incident was gone now. Neither of them could look at Mount Rainier the way they once had. Then, exactly 1 month after the encounter, Jane found something she hadn't expected. She was conducting a routine patrol on the southern slopes, well away from the military exclusion zone, when she noticed something carved into a tree. She stopped. The mark looked fresh, but it wasn't carved. Jane stepped closer. The letters appeared to have grown directly from the bark, as though the tree itself had been persuaded to form them. She read the message. Jane, meet me at Reflection Lake, midnight. Come alone. Then 2 initials. S.C. Jane stared at them. Sarah Chen, alive, free, and trying to contact her. Jane immediately deleted the GPS record of her patrol routes. She told nobody. And that night at midnight she stood alone beside Reflection Lake. The water was almost perfectly still. Mount Rainier rose behind it, reflected in the black surface so clearly that the mountain seemed to exist twice, one version in the sky, another beneath her feet. Then she heard movement behind her. Thank you for coming. Jane turned, and Chen stepped out of the forest. At first glance, she looked human. Then Jane looked closer. All the changes were impossible to miss. Sarah's skin seemed to shift between solid and translucent, as though something beneath it didn't entirely belong in 3-dimensional space. Well, her eyes were the worst. They looked normal for half a second, and then Jane caught the light in them. It was as if she were looking into distant galaxies. Even Sarah's movements were subtly wrong, much too smooth and precise, as if gravity was only a suggestion. Sarah. Jane struggled to find the right words. Are you... I'm still me. And she smiled, and her voice was familiar. There were strange harmonics beneath it now, layers of sound that hadn't been there before. Still Sarah. She stepped closer, but also more. Jane stared at her. The entity didn't control me, Jane. Now Sarah's expression became serious. It gave me a choice. A choice? A chance to become what humanity needs. Jane thought about the soldiers on the glacier. Hey, the government is hunting you. I know. They think you're compromised. They think I'm dangerous. Sarah gave a sad smile. Well, maybe they're right about one of those things. Jane almost laughed. How have you stayed ahead of them? I've learned to move through places they don't know exist. She looked toward the trees. The entity taught me how to fold reality, how to step between dimensions.
Jane just stared at her now, and Sarah held out her hand. Something appeared in her palm, a small crystalline device. Well, it looked delicate and beautiful, and completely alien. This is a beacon. Jane didn't touch it, not yet. In exactly 50 years, others will come. Others? The entity's people, representatives from what you could call the Galactic Council. Sarah's eyes reflected the dark surface of Reflection Lake. They'll decide whether humanity is ready to join the wider community of conscious life. Jane looked at the device. And this? This beacon will call the people who are ready to learn, ready to evolve. She placed it carefully in Jane's hand. I need someone I can trust to protect it. Jane looked down. Why me? Because when everyone else saw something frightening, you merely tried to understand it. And Sarah's voice softened now. You stood between that entity and a military attack. She smiled. You're a guardian by nature, Jane. Her eyes then moved to the beacon. And this needs a guardian. Jane closed her fingers around it. The device was warm, not warm like machinery, almost alive. It pulsed gently against her palm. What am I supposed to do with it? Hide it. Sarah's voice became firm now. Protect it. And she paused. Then, 50 years from now, on September 12th, 2008, Jane frowned. 2000 and... Sarah smiled faintly. You'll know the date. Jane looked down at the beacon again. Bring it here. Sarah pointed toward Reflection Lake. And activate it. Well, what happens then? Those who are ready will hear the call. Jane looked across the dark water toward Mount Rainier. And they'll come? They'll gather. Sarah's expression was a bit solemn now. They'll become humanity's first ambassadors to the universe. Jane let out a slow breath. God, I'll be 88 or... She looked at Sarah. If I'm even still alive. You will be alive. There was no hesitation in Sarah's voice. The certainty of it was almost frightening. The beacon will make sure of that. This made Jane stiffen. How? Not by controlling you. Sarah shook her head. No, through subtle influence, keeping your body healthy, your mind sharp, your senses alert. She studied Jane's face. Well, it's already started. It was true. Jane felt it. For the first time, she noticed something she'd been ignoring. A strange vitality had been building inside her. She felt stronger, sharper, more awake. Oh, she hadn't felt this good since her 20s. It was subtle, but it was real. Jane looked back at Sarah now. What about you? She closed her hand around the beacon. What are you going to do for the next 50 years? Sarah smiled at this. Teach. Prepare. I'll find others with potential, Sarah said. People who can handle what comes next. I'll show them small pieces of what's possible. Nothing that will send them running into the street screaming. Just enough to make them question what they thought they knew. She spoke about dreams, sudden inspiration, ideas arriving from nowhere, moments when someone woke in the middle of the night with an impossible solution in their head. Humanity will change, Jane, but it won't be because aliens force us to change. It'll happen because we choose to grow. As Sarah spoke, something strange began happening to her. She wasn't walking away, she was disappearing. Her body slowly became translucent, edges dissolving into the darkness around her. Wait, Jane called. How do I contact you? You don't. Sarah's voice was already becoming faint. It's safer that way. We shouldn't meet again until the time comes. Jane stepped toward her. When? You'll know. Sarah looked back at her. But remember this, you are not alone. There are others like you, guardians protecting different pieces of the same puzzle.
None of you have the whole picture. The form continued to fade. Together you're preparing the path. And then she was gone. Jane stood alone beside Reflection Lake, the black water reflecting Mount Rainier beneath a sky full of stars. In her hand was a device that didn't belong on Earth, and ahead of her was a 50-year mission. So, my dear friends, yes, I feel like I'm finally back from several months of not feeling great at all. Quite a bad illness, some personal tragedies in my life and everything. But feels like, I don't know, it's all over and I can move on and everything will be good from now on. So I hope you enjoyed that just over an hour long story. Weird and wonderful. Didn't see where that was going, to be honest with you. But yeah, nice bit of sci-fi mixed with a park ranger theme. And yeah, I found that to be a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Okay, so park ranger story. I've got an urbex kind of thing, exploring an abandoned Catholic school, and of course, zombie apocalypse. You know, the backdated history ones. I've got one based in ancient Egypt as well. So if you like the sound of that, just I don't know, chat in the comment section. I'll do my best as ever to join in the conversations. And yeah, I've got some more series that I should be rounding off that are long overdue. You seem to like that pizza delivery one. That was something I'd kind of started a year or so ago. So yeah, glad to. That's kind of a screwball comedy kind of thing mixed in with cults and anyway, anything. So yeah, I really enjoy that one, so I'm glad to hear that you did too. Anyway, I am getting to the waffling on part of my monologue at the end of the story, so I'm going to shut up very soon. I do generally feel like I'm back and, you know, got some good stuff coming up in the next few months, so thank you for sticking with me, and I will be around for another 10 years, shall we say, at least. Okay, my dear friends, so the next time, you'll have very sweet dreams, yeah? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.